Hello, and welcome back to Random Vids. So, a few months ago, back in February, I did a video called Me Reviewing the Bitsy Betrayal story. So, basically, that was a story based off of two good friends of mine, that being Lucas from Button Bambi Super Kitties and Star from Star Stories. So, they went together and they did this Bitsy Betrayal story where they kind of made up their own little thing, which is kind of cool. And I love seeing people use Super Kitties in very creative ways, and I love the stories, and they did a really good job with it. So they requested me then to review another story that they did. This one being Catty's identity crisis. So Catty is Cat Burglar. Cat Burglar is one of the four villains in Super Kitties. And what's really interesting about Super Kitties villains is the fact that they're not necessarily villains, they just more do villainous things. And obviously the Super Kitties stop them, and then they end up explaining why they did what they did. So they're not just your stereotypic bad guy. Like, they have reasons for doing things, and they even have their own stories, and sometimes they don't even feel like villains in their episodes anyway. Heck, sometimes they're thrown in, and they get caught up in another villain's plan. It's kind of funny. But anywho, Lucas and Star did a story together on the character Cat Burglar and his identity crisis, as it's called. This is basically a part 2 to the Bitsy Betrayal. So I thought it would be a good idea to kind of review the Catty's identity crisis. So Lucas, Star, anyone else, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to see what other stories you come up with. So with that, let's get started. So it looks like the story starts with them at the Parent Play, you know how most Super Kitties episodes starts. This is after the Bitsy Betrayal. Now, it's been a minute since I've seen Bitsy Betrayal, so I don't necessarily remember that story, but for Catty's identity crisis, it kind of starts off with everyone, you know, looking at Bitsy, making sure she's fine, because she had that quote-unquote life as a, not life, but she kind of had that perspective as a stray cat. So everyone ends up trying to comfort her, and everyone's like, alright, let's just let her have her space, and let her be able to, you know, kind of calm down a bit, get, like, start, whatever, you know what I mean, like, calm down or whatever. Then they get a call on the quote-unquote Super Kitty call. Basically, that's how they find out about missions and, you know, someone stealing something, whatever. So they go down to their cave, and they find out that Cat Burglar is stealing stuff. But he's doing it forcefully this time. He isn't doing it just for funsies or that he wants to, or like he's doing it for someone. No, he's being forced to do this, and this is something we'll learn obviously as the story goes on. Bitsy, of course, is very worried because, you know, it's Cat Burglar. This is the same character who she was trying to help out in the Bitsy Betrayal story. So they get to, I guess, Cat Burglar, and they see someone else with him, which that ends up being his mother. So as we learn in this story, Cat Burglar, I guess, is a villain due to his parents, which honestly, I could definitely see that in the show actually being an actual episode. How is Cat Burglar a villain? Why is he doing the stuff he does? And it could completely make sense that it is his parents who are the ones that are, you know, forcing him to be a burglar, like the family tradition. And it almost it explains why his grandma is also a villain, but she's kind of taking it a little more slower in a way, because because Cat Burglar's parents are basically forcing Cat Burglar, you know, I'm just going to say Catty, that's much shorter, are forcing Catty to be a villain and steal stuff. And Catty is starting to have sort of second thoughts. And of course, Bitsy is worried because she was there in the Bitsy Betrayal trying to help out Cat Burglar. So she's kind of shocked to see him, you know, stealing stuff again. At one point, they end up robbing Pickles. They steal something of his I don't necessarily remember, so he starts crying, and they go and find him and stuff. He says that Catty's mom called him a bad kitty and that he's rude and spoiled. You know, typical stuff a villain would do. Well, a villain in the Super Kitty show would do. So there's that, and they end up, I guess, kind of finding a clue of where Catty and his mom went. So eventually, Catty and his mom end up at his parents' house, and his parents are both very, oh, what's the word? They love stealing things. They're villains, etc. And then the Super Kitties end up getting into Cat Burglar's house, or I guess Catty's house, his parents' house, whatever. Somewhere in there, Bambi and Lassie join. So if you don't know who they are, Bambi is obviously from the movie Bambi. Lassie is a character I'm not so familiar on, but basically Lucas loves Bambi and Lassie, so they end up appearing in the story. Lassie is some sort of dog. Anyway, I guess they appear with the Super Kitties at some point. I don't know necessarily what their main story is here. I think it's just mainly them adding on to the Super Kitties. So, okay, that's interesting. So at this point, obviously, we're starting to learn more about Catty's parents. Like I said, I can totally see this being an actual thing in Super Kitties, where Catty is only a burglar because his parents force him to. And he kind of gets help from his grandma. His grandma probably, Granny Katrina, probably knows the way of Catty's parents. So she helps him out in order for his parents to be pleased, but she's also not mean and rude to Catty in a way either. So they both have a nice grandmother-grandson relationship in a way. And that also explains why we see Catty hanging out with his grandma on the show and not with his parents. Kind of interesting how the lore kind of, links together in the way. Anyway, at some point, Catty's dad ends up grabbing Bitsy's arm, and he's it's like one of those, like, you better watch out for us type things. And then, of course, everyone makes sure Bitsy's arm is okay. I think the main reason why I think he did that is because Bitsy is the one who was trying to help Cat Burglar out, and they end up finding out about that. Bitsy was the one who ended up trying to help Cat Burglar past his ways. So his dad obviously was furious about that. So then Catty and his parents end up going into a different room without the Super Kitties, and they end up kind of obviously having a big argument, and it's a bunch of the back and forth stuff. And at one point his parents say, well, you should have kept Bitsy, like, almost kind of like they wanted him to bring Bitsy to their side. And Bitsy overhears it, and obviously it's a lot of trash talking of Bitsy and then eventually Catty. So that's how a lot of that ended up going. A lot of that, you will never be our son type of thing, which obviously is hurtful to Catty because these are his parents saying this stuff to him, so of course he's hurt. He does have his cousin Sassy there. His cousin Sassy is basically, his cousin. She appears in season 2 of Super Kitties. But anyway, she ends up making sure Catty's okay, and Catty seems to be doing fine. Like, he almost seems kind of like maybe relieved in a way that he doesn't necessarily have to worry about his parents anymore. So eventually the Super Kitties invite Catty to stay with them. So, okay, that's kind of cool and all. I mean, Catty is a cat, after all. Obviously he's not a kitten, but, the Super Kitties do live at the Purr and Play, run by Amara. So I'm sure she ain't gonna mind seeing another cat there, because she's a big animal person. And they want to make sure Catty's okay and stuff. Like, they don't want him to feel lonely and stuff, because he doesn't really necessarily have them. Not that we really see in the show. He has, like, a little abandoned apartment, possibly, that we saw in episodes like Lost Spark, but that's about it. Otherwise, he's basically in the alley for most of the time. So, hearing all this from his parents obviously makes him upset. So the Super Kitties invite him to the Purr and Play. When they're all back in Kittydale, Catty ends up apologizing to everybody, like Pickles, and I believe they end up returning. He ends up returning all. I think they ended up taking Mr. Greenie from Bitsy at some point when Catty's mom was stealing a bunch of different things, or Catty's mom was making Cat Burglar steal a bunch of things. I think he stole Mr. Greenie, which is basically Bitsy's toy mouse. They stole some from Pickles, and he ended up returning it. So he ended up basically apologizing to everybody, and then they ended up heading off to the Purr and Play, where they ended up handing off Catty to Amara. Then Pip and Freddy end up showing up around this time of the story, and Pip and Freddy, if you don't know, basically are the main characters of the TV show Tots. Not a show I've seen too much, but I forget who is who. Pip, I think, is the penguin, and then Freddy is this flamingo bird thing. But they end up appearing in the Catty's Identity Crisis as well. basically, like, it's almost, I guess it's almost like everyone's like, oh wow, like Catty is staying with the Super Kitties, and I guess it's almost like a big crossover in a way between Bambi and then there's Lassie. Pip and Freddy are here as well, so basically a big crossover, which is kind of cool. I think at some point they end up taking him to the vet to make sure he's okay, which of course he's okay. So that was just a little bit of something that I wanted to point out in the story. He ends up going to bed. Obviously everything's okay. At some point in the story, obviously we have Bambi in it, and we have his dad, who is the great prince of the forest. And at some point he ends up getting sticky syrup in his antlers. I think it is. I think it's one of those ones where Catty does it, and he ends up apologizing. I don't remember, but I think that's how the story ends up going. Or it could have been like all three, because as we know, they were forcing Catty to do all this stuff. Then, as we get into the rising action of the story, Sassy ends up coming into town. This is Catty's cousin. So last time we saw her was in Catty's parents' house. Well, she ends up going to the Pern play and ends up stealing Bitsy. So, ooh, yeah, Bitsy definitely had some sort of big role in making Catty's parents very upset. Most likely the fact that she was trying to help Catty out. So I don't think they were really too pleased with that, so they made Sassy go and steal Bitsy for them. And even though this is something Sassy does not want to do, she does it anyway, just to, please Catty's parents, to make them, not more angrier than they already are. So obviously when everyone finds out that Bitsy, is nowhere to be found, they end up going to go find her, and I think they know exactly where she is. And of course, by the time Sassy gets there and she ends up regretting it, it's too late. And they end up putting Bitsy in some sort of prison thing, I think. I don't know. The problem is that some of the story is kind of cut out, it almost seems like, in a way. This was the part of the story that kind of didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think it's because, there's been a thing going on recently where some of the YouTube comments haven't been popping up, which is very strange and bizarre, but okay. So I think this was part of that story that ended up happening, where some of the comments weren't popping up. So some scenes feel a little, I don't know. I read it and I was just a little confused in a way. But then when I was actually reading it, then I was like, okay, wait, I think I know what's going on now. So Sassy ends up regretting what she did to Bitsy, but it was already too late, and her uncle end up having a fight, Catty's dad. So then obviously everyone ends up arriving, I guess, back at Catty's house to try to find Bitsy. And Sassy tries to warn them about, what's going to happen. And they end up falling into a trap and end up getting trapped into a big bubble. At this point, Sassy, Catty's cousin, is over her aunt and uncle, too. So she's basically now on the Super Kitty side. So, kind of interesting, the way, because I can totally see that in Sassy, too. Because she's the type of character who, once again, like, it's like she's even more of a villain than Catty is, because I don't know, she just, in the few episodes that she was in for season 2, she didn't necessarily seem like a villain in a way, but at the same time I could totally see why she would be one. You see, this is why the Super Kitties villains are so interesting, because I shouldn't say they're complex characters, that they sort of are. They're more complex than normal, typical villains, but that's what makes them fun. Like, they're not just your stereotypic bad guys. Like, there's other shows, I'm trying to think of a good example right now, which I can't think of one right now, but you get what I mean. Like, there's stories where the villains are just so bland and boring that, I could care less about them. But I love how Super Kitties does their villains. Catty's my favorite one, just because of the fact that he has so much character potential in him. So, and of course, Star and Lucas having these stories with Catty in it, obviously, it's fun seeing where the story goes, and I'm interested in what's going to happen next. Anyway, so they're all still stuck in a bubble. Well, Catty ends up popping it by some sort of sharp stick, I think it is. And they all end up, obviously falling out of the bubble, and they have to go then save Bitsy, who, is still in this cage thing. So they end up doing that. So what it seems like now is Catty is now part of the Super Kitties, because he ends up getting an emblem like all the other Super Kitties do. And all the Super Kitties have their own powers. Well, I don't think Sparks necessarily has a power, but he flies on the Super Kitty kit, so, you know, I'm counting it as a power. Catty's is to turn invisible, which I could totally see that happening, especially because, you know, he's Cat Burglar, even though, obviously, he's, in this story, changing from being a burglar to being, you know, nice and stuff, but as a, like, pretend this story didn't happen, and if he did end up joining the Super Kitties, then I could totally see him, like, his power being just invisibility, because he can sneak around and steal stuff. Anyway, back to the story. I'm getting off topic. So then they end up getting Bitsy out of that cage, and they end up stopping Catty's parents, and all ends well, and they end up going back to Kittydale, which is kind of cool. Now, something that I also found that was kind of funny is that, like, everyone's parents ended up meeting up together to, I guess, kind of help. So Lucas and Star have their own characters for the Super Kitty's parents, which is kind of cool. I don't remember all their names. I just remember, like, Sparks' mom is Bridget, I think it is. I don't remember everyone else, but that's kind of cool. So they all actually have, you know, parents. They're not just at, you know, the Pern play. So they ended up joining, and then Bambi's dad, and I think Thumper as well. And then we even have the Cat Pack from Paw Patrol, which is kind of funny. So we have more crossover characters coming in, which is obviously fun to see. It'd be interesting seeing if Super Kitties actually did have crossover characters eventually. So there's 5 parts to the Catty's identity crisis, and part 5 is basically kind of like a catch-up, a meet everybody, hugs, whatever. Everyone's back at the Pern play. It's kind of like the outro to the episode. The falling action, the back to, you know, the Pern play, etc., etc. So this is basically where the Catty's identity crisis story ends, and his parents end up locked up. So now we're basically at the end of Catty's identity crisis. So overall, I think this is once again a really, really great story. It's a great follow-up to the Bitsy betrayal story, I think. It's a great story overall. I mean, it's just really great. I could totally see this as an episode of Super Kitties, and I think I said that before for the Bitsy betrayal story too. But you know, there's a lot of interesting stuff put into this story that I could totally see it as a Super Kitties episode. Star and Lucas, if you guys are watching, you guys did a fantastic job. Like I'm glad you guys are doing these stories and are enjoying doing them. I'm pretty sure they've made more, because I'm sure they will be making more. It's something they like to do. So props to you guys. You guys did a great job with this. One of my favorite things about the story is probably, I love the crossovers, and I also just love seeing, like, you know, how the title says, Catty's identity crisis. It gives us kind of more of a look into Catty's character. Why is he a burglar? You know, why does he do all this stuff? It gives us more of Sassy, and even Granny Katrina appears in the episode. So it gives us more, you know, character development for Catty's character. Even if this isn't an episode for Super Kitties, it's still fun to watch. And I remember watching this and I was like, man, this is actually really, really good. Like, Lucas and Star, once again, you guys did a really great job, and I hope you guys do enjoy this review. If you have any other video ideas in mind, just let me know down in the comments, and I'll probably get to them eventually. Who knows how long or short that could be, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's fun reviewing some sort of Super Kitties thing. Shout out to Button Bambi Super Kitties, and shout out to Star Stories. Shout out to both of you guys, of course. You guys did a great job. Great story, by the way, and like, you guys killed it. So anywho, with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next week. So have a good day.